All right. The book of Ezekiel is quite a read. Challenging to interpret, picturesque, vivid. It's just quite a prophetic book. In chapter 15, we come to this very short chapter that is alarming in its negativity. When I preached on a Sunday from this chapter, I titled the message, "You're Useless, and It Could Be Worse, and It Will Be." So think about that. You're useless, and it's going to get worse. How could it be more worse than to be told you are useless? This is the kind of language we think of horrible parents saying this to their children. Why on earth would God say this to his chosen people? You are worthless. By no means am I saying or believing that because God has spoken to his people this way, that we are to speak to his people this way, or that we are to speak to our own children this way. God is able to speak to us in ways that we would never speak to each other or to our children. And he has a right to do that because he's God, and he's holy, and he's perfect. And he has perfect motivations when he does things that seem strange to us, when we hear his words that are strange to our ears. So let's look at the chapter and see if I've summarized the meaning of it adequately when I say he's saying you're worthless, you're useless, I should say, and it's going to get worse. Reading from the NIV. The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, how is the wood of a vine different from that of a branch, from any of the trees in the forest? Is wood ever taken from it to make anything useful? Do they make pegs from it to hang things on? And after it is thrown on the fire as fuel, and the fire burns both ends and chars the middle, is it then useful for anything? If it was not useful for anything when it was whole, how much less can it be made into something useful when the fire has burned it and it is charred? Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says, as I have given the wood of the vine among the trees of the forest as fuel for the fire, so will I treat the people living in Jerusalem. I will set my face against them. Although they have come out of the fire will yet consume them. And when I set my face against them, you will know that I am the Lord. I will make the land desolate because they have been unfaithful, declares the sovereign Lord. Do you see how things went from really bad to even worse? They were useless, thrown in the fire because they were useless, but then they were brought out of the fire to even be destroyed even more. How can this be? And how can God speak to his people this way? Well, it's important you know there's this cycle in the Old Testament where God's people are in right relationship with him, but then they stray away from him, and then the next generation doesn't even know the Lord and doesn't serve him, but falls into gross immorality and idolatry and all manner of sin and brokenness and sorrow and strife. God has to call his people back to himself, and usually the way he is able to do this is through bringing discipline in their lives. That's painful, but it causes them to finally look up and ask for him to save them. And here we are again. God's people have strayed so far from him. They have his name, but they don't know him. And so he's calling them back to himself, and the way he's going to do it is through discipline. You're useless right now, but it's going to get worse. You're going to be worse than useless. I'm going to put you through the fire of tribulation in a way. Here's God's goal. Here's his motive that doesn't show up in this chapter, but it's in order to bring them back to himself. Now we'll see that in the next chapter. Ezekiel 15 is just a chapter of doom. Now remember, I've said this frequently. I say it over and over again. When we read and study our Bibles, we need to understand that these chapter divisions were not there in the original writing. So you read chapter 15, you're like, oh my goodness, how on earth could God say all this stuff to his people? And the chapter ends with no hope at all. Well, it's very simple. This isn't the rest of the story. In chapter 16, my title in front of chapter 16 says, Jerusalem as an adulterous wife. He goes on to talk about their sins and how they strayed from him. And he even goes so far as to refer to them as prostitutes. He says, I'm filled with fury against you, verse 30. Verse 32, you adulterous wife. Verse 35, therefore you prostitute, hear the word of the Lord. He's using very strong, shocking language to show them the truth of how far they've strayed from him. Sometimes God has to be very bold and blunt with us about our sin in order to get our attention and tell us we're on the path to destruction. Not as believers who are walking with Christ. I'm not saying that. I'm saying to those who claim to know him or think they belong to God, but they don't. They don't know him. They need salvation. There's a lot of people like that in the United States today. They think they're Christians. They were raised in a Christian home. Maybe they went to church. Maybe they still go to church, but they're far from God, and they're sinning. They're in a lifestyle of sin. And so because of the rebellion, God's saying to them, look, here's really where you're at. You think you're over here. You think you belong to me. You think you're a good person. But here's the truth. You love sin. You're rebellious. That's the truth. And I will say strong things to you to get your attention, to let you know. And so he brings these strong words to a conclusion pretty much in verse 59 of chapter 16. This is what the sovereign Lord says, I will deal with you as you deserve because you have despised my oath by breaking the covenant. Again, it's bad news. But verse 60, we see a pivot, we see a switch, and then there's hope. Verse 60, yet I will remember the covenant I made with you in the days of your youth, and I will establish an everlasting covenant with you. Then you will remember your ways and be ashamed when you receive your sisters, both those who are older than you and those who are younger. Verse 62, so I will establish my covenant with you, and you will know that I am the Lord. Then, when I make atonement for you for all you've done, you will remember and be ashamed, and never again open your mouth because of your humiliation, declares the sovereign Lord. God deals strongly with us to bring him to himself in order that we might be in his love.